Hello everybody and welcome back to another recent reads video on Sunday in which I discuss the books or some of the books that I've read recently. And the first two books I want to talk to you about are both nonfiction, and I will sort of discuss them together because they tackle a similar subject but from a different angle. And the first one is Rebecca Traister's book Good and Mad, which was published end of last year, 2018. And the other one is this one, Rage... No. Anyway, Rage Becomes Her by Soraya Chemaly, which was also published at the end of last year. And as you can see from the title, both books tackle the subject of rage, and then particularly the rage of women. Rebecca Traister, the first one, is an American journalist. She was born in 1975, and she calls herself a feminist journalist, and she has published widely on a variety of topics, but always from a feminist point of view. She wrote a book, All the Single Ladies, about being single and independent in 2016, and this one, Good and Mad, is her latest. And it discusses, like the book by Soraya Chemaly, it discusses female rage and how we, in our Western society, look upon and deal with female rage, and how we treat it differently than male rage, especially in the American context, male rage by white dudes. The premise of both books is that male rage, and again, in the US context, white male rage, is something positive, something affirmative, something that is valid and gives you status, whereas female anger is suppressed, that we are taught as women from early on that we shouldn't, get angry and shout and, things like that. And just to illustrate the point, for any of you who have watched the confirmation hearings, Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing in the Senate last year, where you saw his accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, accusing him of sexual assault when Brett Kavanaugh was 16, 17, and then Brett Kavanaugh's response. And if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, you should probably go on YouTube and watch it, because there you could see that Christine Blasey Ford, even though she has probably every reason to be angry about what happened to her, not only in the past, but also how she was treated, how her name was leaked, etc., but she never showed any anger. She was quiet in the sense of, a quiet voice. She was collegial. She tried to be rational, not showing any emotion. And then you had the complete contrast when Brett Kavanaugh defended himself. He was raging, he was yelling, he was tearing up. And these two approaches to how you deal with your anger, both authors, Rebecca Traister and Soraya Chemaly, say is symptomatic for how we genderize anger. Now, Rebecca Traister's book looks at anger in a political context. So especially she wrote the book after Trump was elected president in 2016, and then Harvey Weinstein, the Me Too movement, the Women's March. So she places anger in a political context, whereas Soraya Chemaly, put it here, also an American journalist, a little bit older than Rebecca Traister. Traister was born in 1975, and Chemaly is about 10 years older, and she looks at anger more from an individual point of view. So how do we teach our children to deal with anger in school, in preschool, university, on an individual level, in family. So it's more a psychological evaluation of how we treat female and male anger differently. The two books really go well together because, like I said, the same subject but from a different angle. So I read one after the other. And there's the third book also dealing with this. It's obviously a hot topic, women showing their anger, in the Me Too movement and beyond. And that is Brittany Cooper's book, Eloquent Rage, which was also published last year. And Brittany Cooper is a Black feminist scholar, and she looks specifically at Black women and her anger. So I probably will read that third book, if not next week, then soon after, because I think those three books really go well together and give a good perspective of the topic of female anger. Oh, and I forgot to mention, if you're interested in the topic and in the book and the books and in the authors, I will leave a link down below in the show notes to a podcast done by the Reading Women, Kendra Winchester's podcast, together with Autumn Privet is her name. Yes, Autumn Privet. It's a fantastic podcast. You should check it out, and Kendra's channel, of course, as well. But anyway, in one of the latest podcasts, there's an interview with Soraya Shamali. So I'll leave the link, like I said, down below if you're interested. And reading those two books and planning on reading the third, and checking out Rebecca Treister and Soraya Shamali on YouTube. There's a lot of interviews and talks in bookstores. I was thinking, because I'm an older generation, I was thinking about the past and how feminism developed, and I decided to read an old classic, quote unquote, of feminist literature, and that is Marilyn French's book, a novel, The Women's Room, which was first published in 1977, and I read it as a teenager in my late teens, early 20s, in the German translation back then, and I decided to reread it. Now, Marilyn French was one of the most famous American feminists. She was born in 1929 and she died 10 years ago. She's written extensively on the subject, nonfiction and fiction. And the novel The Women's Room centers around women born around 1930, so being in their 20s and 30s, in the 1950s and 60s. The main character is Myra, and her life, being married young, then having two children, being a housewife in the suburbs, but also there are plenty of characters, Myra's friends in the suburbs, couples, the women she describes. So the book describes a wide variety of female lives, focusing, even though most of the women are married and have children, but focusing on the women and how patriarchy works and how women are treated, about female sexuality, about the impossibility of having an independent life other than, marry and get out of your parents' house, but that's not real independence because then you depend on the man. It's a very political book, so if you don't like your books to have a political message, this is probably not for you. But I was riveted when I was in my early 20s and read it because it showed me something about the generation of my mother. My mother is born in 1931, and even though she didn't have that kind of typical marriage, she worked almost all her life, but still it gave me a good picture of where we came from. I still really enjoyed it when I reread it now. I saw more flaws of it. Sometimes the political message is a bit heavy-handed. But again, it was published in 1977. So I think if you're interested in feminist literature, then The Women's Room is certainly, a book you should read. And I think the stories are, even now, 40 years after the publication, the stories of these women are really very individual, very well drawn. They are not cliched or cardboard as a character. And it's heartbreaking at times to see how women struggled. Marilyn French, by the way, also wrote a really, really interesting history of women. This is the first volume of a 4-volume book, History of Women in the World. And this one is from Eve to Dawn. So in the ancient world, she looks at Egypt, Greece, Rome, Sumerian women, and then goes on until almost the present, because she died 10 years ago. So if you're interested in female history, this book or this series is really worth your while. And from all these feminist books onto something completely different, I read a classic also the past weeks, and that is Elizabeth Gaskell's book, Sylvia's Lovers, published in 1863. Elizabeth Gaskell, of course, a famous English writer in the mid-19th century. She died 1865. This was a buddy read with Olive from a book Olive, and we read another Elizabeth Gaskell together last year, North and South, which we both really, really loved. So Sylvia's Lovers, because they are, of course, more than one, there are 2, is set in a small town, Monkshaven in Yorkshire, a fictitious town, at the end of the 18th century, so 1798-ish. The main female character, Sylvia, is a young woman. Beginning of the novel, she is 16, 17. She is a farmer's daughter, and she is pursued by 2 men. Philip, who is decent, at least he seems so, but we will see whether that holds up during the course of the novel. He's an ambitious man, working in a shop in the village, and then, becoming the shop owner, and prosperous, ambitious man, but a bit dull. And Sylvia is not really into him. Instead, she falls in love with Charlie, who is a harpooner on a whaling ship, dashing, but he has a bad reputation. There is betrayal that forces Sylvia's hand to marry one of the 2, and then the betrayal is revealed, and the story goes on from there. Olive hasn't put up a review yet, so I will only leave a link to her channel down below, but I'm sure she will review the book. And we both liked it, but didn't really love it. And for me, that were 2 reasons why. In the end, I really enjoyed it, but not as much as the previous book, North and South. First of all, the book has an extremely slow start. The first third, almost half of the book, there is almost no plot. There is very little happening. The characters are introduced, and we learn a lot about the historical and political background, especially the French-English War during the end of the 18th century, and the so-called press gangs, Navy soldiers who forcibly enlist young men into the Navy in order to fight the war. That is explained extensively, and like I said, also village life and everything is explained extensively, and the novel's plot only picks up after almost half of the book, and then it's getting really paced, and a lot is happening, and people are dying left and right and betraying each other left and right. So I enjoyed the second half much more than the first half, but it's an extremely slow start. And the other thing that I struggled with is that the book has a lot of dialogue in it, and every dialogue is in dialect. It's this northern Yorkshire 18th century dialect, which for me, as a non-native English speaker, was really hard to read and get into and understand. I had to read, in the beginning, a lot of the dialogues, I had to read it out loud in order to get the language. And after a while, after, you know, a third or half of the book, you learn it, so to speak, and then it's easier. But it was a real struggle for me. So it's an interesting book, looking, you know, at a female life at the end of the 18th century, and it's very moral, you know, about betrayal and being a good man or a good woman. And I can recommend it, but with these two sort of, you know, warnings that the dialect is difficult and it's very, very slow. And to finish my recent reads with another classic that I reread, Jane Austen's first book, Sense and Sensibility, published in 1811. Now, I said reread. I read 3 or 4 of Jane Austen's novels when I was very young, but in the German translation. And I wanted to reread them in the order of publication in English for a long time, and I finally started with this one. And I'm not going to talk extensively about the plot. It's about mainly 2 sisters, Elizabeth Dashwood and her younger sister Marianne. They both fall in love. Marianne with the dashing young man John Willoughby, but that doesn't work out really well. There's another love interest, an older man, or at least older from Marianne's perspective. He's 35, Colonel Brandon, and she finds him dull. And her older sister Elizabeth also falls in love, but much less. She shows her passion in a much more subdued way. Her love interest is Edgar Ferrars. But there's problems as well, because Edward has some years ago promised himself to another woman when he was very young, and you know, it all is well in the end, of course, as you know, either if you read the book or if you've seen the movie. This was never my favorite Jane Austen, I have to say, but I enjoyed the reread. It's an enjoyable, easy read. What I find interesting is, especially if you, like me, have the movie in mind, you know, with this heightened sensation of the climax when Edward kneels down and declares his love, or when Marianne finally finds out about Willoughby. And in the book, all those highlights are much quieter. So I find it interesting how Jane Austen tells us a story really sort of softly and smoothly, without all the excitement and highlighting scenes that we now obviously want and that we've seen in the movie. Anyway, I've started my reread of Jane Austen in the original, mainly also because Steve, over at Steve Donahue, whom you all know and love, will host a read-along of Pride and Prejudice in March. I'll leave a link to his announcement video down below, and I thought I want to participate, but because I wanted to read the Jane Austen novels in sequence, and Sense and Sensibility was published before Pride and Prejudice, I read this in February. Anyway, so these were my recent reads on this very warm Sunday. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, talk to me down in the comments. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.